Hey, how's it going? Today, I'm talking about how to catch up if you miss a run. So, this conversation happens all the time. And I've actually talked about this before, episode 63 in this podcast. You can go listen to that and just see if anything has updated. The general information will likely be very close to being the same. So I got a question in the DMs on Instagram, runDisney Please send me a question. Thank you so much for asking this one. And it was that this person has leg pain. They're going to take time off so that their leg can heal, but they want to make sure that they get back into running and training for Dopey the right way. At the time of recording this is the beginning of November. We're about 8 weeks away, 9 weeks away from Dopey. So they are planning well in advance. I love me some planning, so A+ on that. And they have been following my free training plan from my website. So they said, the most recent training I did was week 17, which should be 10.7 miles. They ran a race, a 15K, which for those of you like me who don't really think of things in kilometers, that is 9 miles and change. So this person decided, well, I'm not going to do the whole 10.7 because I ran faster at this race. So did the 15K, called it good. Now their leg hurts when they run. They want to take a couple of weeks off to let it heal, but want to know how to get back into it. So I did send them to episode 63. They listened to it and came back with questions. And I even said, tell me what questions you have after and let me help you get back on the right path. So they did. They sent me another question and said, okay, so for this, I'll just skip the deload week, which is the advice that I give in episode 63. Spoiler alert, that's the episode, that's the advice I give. And go from there. And so they wanted to jump right back into 12.95 miles, which is the training, the long run that is scheduled for November 9th. Was this going to be too big of a jump to go between 9 to 12.93 miles? Because it doesn't follow the 10% rule. It is more than 10%. So let's talk about my thought process with this. So for one, yes, that is more than 10%. It is, let's see, it's about a 30% jump. Definitely more than 10%. Now, if this were a half marathon race, and let's say they had the half marathon race coming up in a week or two, I would say that jump is fine. Okay? Reason being, you can avoid or you can ignore, that's a better phrase, you can ignore the 10% rule one time. Following the 10% rule comes from repetitive injury. And that's what 90% of running injuries are. They are caused by overuse repetitive injuries. So you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, repeat, repetitive, and that's what causes the problem. So when somebody adds 1 mile to their long run and they are running less than 10 miles for their long run, doing that week over week, it will eventually catch up. And at about 6 to 8 weeks, you're going to have pain because you've been adding too much for 6 to 8 weeks. But you're not necessarily going to have that pain if you just do it once. So for anybody who's wondering about that 10% rule and, where does it come into play? It comes into play when you're doing things over and over and over and over again. But you will notice that on my training plans, you go from 10 miles to half marathon. Well, that's definitely more than a 10% increase, but you can do it once. You're not doing that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks in a row. You're doing it one time and then you're recovering immediately after. And also, if you're following the training plan as I have it laid out, you are doing that 10-mile long run so slow, it's taking you the same amount of time as half marathon race day will take. So then technically, you aren't even adding more, you're just going faster, but you're on your feet for that same amount of time. And that's why I do it that way. Train your body so that you're out there for that amount of time. As an example, when I trained for the Halloween half marathon weekend at Disneyland in September, my long run was 10 miles and I made it take me 3 hours because I anticipated my half marathon would take me 3 hours. And it did. It took me 3 hours and 5 minutes, and that included 2 bathroom stops, 2 character stops, a flyby castle photo, and stopping to take video here and there. So, 5 minutes in the grand scheme of things, that's practically the same amount of time. So, and it worked. I clearly ran faster on race day, had time for those character stops, and had time to take footage for my Instagram reels, and felt just dandy. Went to the park all day. Forget how many steps I took that day. I mean, it's been 2 months now. But let's get back to talking about Dopey. So this person had planned to skip technically the 10.7-mile long run because they didn't do it that day. Skip the 11.77-mile long run and go right into the 12.95. I don't recommend that. I do agree with skipping the deload week, which is going to be November 23rd. That deload week is for adjustments just like this. So it's either to allow your body to play catch up as you're building mileage and drop it back down so that if you're an injury prone runner, you have this wiggle room. Or if you're a slow back of the pack runner, you have this wiggle room so that if you can't do all of your training, you need, to move things around in the schedule. That's what this is there for. So this person would be using this exactly as planned. Cut that deload week. They don't need it at this point. It's a nice to have. It's not a need to have. It's a nice to have. They cut it out so that they can just progressively keep going. I don't recommend doing the 12.95. I do recommend going back to 10.7, or even they could go 10% above that 15K. But looking at this information that this person following the training plan, if they followed the training plan as is to a T, they would have done 9.73 miles on 10/12. So, of course, 10% more than that is going to be that 10.7 miles. That's what I have planned in there. So, they could do the 10% more than that. They could even do 15% more because technically the 10% rule has some wiggle room. It's really 10 to 15%, but the 10 to 15% rule doesn't flow off your tongue. So let's do the lesser of that, and you could go up by 15%, and it still would be just a slim difference. So we have a couple options here. We can do 10.7 miles. Let's talk about that option. 10.7 miles on, let's say, November 9th. So then that means the next week is going to be 11.77. And then the next week would normally be a deload week. And we're going to cut that and we're going to do 12.95. Then the following week would be 14.24. I'm just reading these exactly as they are on the training plan. Then the next week would be 15.67, then 17.24, Then the following week, if we're following the training plan as is, would technically be 20 miles, and we skipped 18.96. Well, going from 17.24 to 20 miles what is that? Equal, let's see. So that is more than 10%. So an option would be, if they're just following it, nix the 20 miler and stop at 19, the 18.96 miles. Because technically, when we're talking about the 10% rule and going up to just 70% of race distance, 70% of race distance lands just above 18 miles. So you'll still hit the bare minimum. I add in a 20 miler on there because every single runner I've worked with has wanted to get to 20 miles. Every single one of them. So I add that in there because 20 miles, you hit just like it's a mental shift where my runners say it's just a 10K after that. If I can get to 20 miles, I know it's just a 10K after that. So instead of stopping at 18, let me give them that 20 miler and we'll work it in there. But you could just stop at the 18.96 as your peak long run and then start taper. Another option would be do the 15% increase, and then you wouldn't have to change and shift things around quite as much. I'm not going to do the math on there. If you want to, just add in 15% increases, pull it up in a Google Sheet or Excel. Heck, even ask ChatGPT, how do I increase this mileage by 15% each week? And hopefully it will tell you. Now, remember, ChatGPT tells you the statistically most likely answer. It's not always 100% accurate. It's not always giving facts. It's just giving, statistically speaking, what's most likely to be that answer. So that's where you need to be careful with ChatGPT with things, but just check the math after. Ask it how it did its math if you're not sure. But you can just increase by 15% to do that math. And then you'll be able to figure out, okay, where are we at? The good news is this person has been following the training plan up until this point and just needs the minor tweaks and adjustments at this point because they've been following it. You know, if this is a good conversation to have now, thinking for next training cycle, next year doing Dopey, how could we have gotten ahead of this before it even happened? So anytime you're doing a race, plan that you're going to be sore afterward and you're going to need 1 to 2 weeks to recover, depending on the distance. So if it's a 5K, you may only need a week to recover. 10K and above, maybe 2 weeks. But let's factor in that information for recovery. So one thing that could have happened would be that looking at the Dopey training plan, the week of October 19th was a deload week. So this person actually could have flip-flopped, done the 10.7 during that deload week. And then the week of the race, that's a deload week. But they could have manipulated it so then the week after, they could have had that deload week, that recovery week in there for them. They could have, you can always skip a deload week. And by skip, I mean not fast forward, but literally like not run that week or run even fewer miles. I put in whatever 70% of the previous distance was because that's typically what somebody should do. But if you can't run at all that week because you're sick, life got lifey, work, regular life schedule, you can't run, that's okay for a deload week. So recovering from a race could be that deload week. So whenever you're looking at training for a race and you have other races in there, this is very common where in my half marathons, my runners want to do a 5K or a 10K distance, or in their marathon or dopey training, they're doing some kind of half marathon in there, like wine and dine as an example. I work in Stronger, Faster, Finisher. You tell me all of the races you're doing, and I work in the recovery weeks that you're going to need. Maybe you don't need a rest and recovery day from a 5K, rest and recovery week from a 5K, but maybe you do because you're going faster. So faster requires recovery as well, in addition to just longer for race day speak, right? So let's factor this in. So, shoulda, coulda, woulda, you can't change the past. You're getting at it now. So that's wonderful. In the future, if you're planning on doing this, go ahead and look at the schedule ahead of time and see how you can manipulate the schedule in advance before race ever happens so that you can give yourself that rest and recovery that you need. Because remember, there are 5 phases to a successful running journey. We have rest and recovery, which is immediately after a race. And that is part of having a successful running journey, because if you didn't catch this leg pain now, you could keep running through it. And so you need to rest and recover to make sure that this is nothing and this is just things are amped up from race day. And then from rest and recovery, we go into the build phase typically, but you might jump right back into training phase, which a lot of runDisney runners do because the running season starts in the fall and goes through the spring. And a lot of us are doing multiple race weekends. So you might jump right into training, and then there's race phase, and then there's taper phase, and then there's race phase, and then we're back to rest and recovery. Sometimes we skip that build phase. The build phase for runDisney runners is typically after that rest and recovery phase of your last race. So that might be springtime surprise. So for me, it's going to be after springtime surprise because that's the last one that I'm doing. I'm technically in training mode until I finish springtime surprise. And you may be too. But let's look at in the future, like I said, shoulda, coulda, woulda. You can't change the past. Let's just work on where we're at. There's no judgment. It's where we are, but this is a learning experience. If we do this again, this kind of training next year, let's look at the schedule in advance. Let's see where vacations are, where races fall on the schedule so that we can adjust for it.